Hey everybody, welcome back to the theory of evolution versus creation. And in this video, I'm just going to go through some interesting discoveries that we have made around the world that again just reveal a different narrative than the one that we've always been told. And I just wanted to look at this real quick, that if we really did have a flood, a worldwide flood that happened about 4,400 years ago, there's several predictions that we can make based on that knowledge. And the first is that the Earth should have many layers of strata. And so floods and moving water automatically create lots of strata. And you can actually see this for yourself. If you take a jar and you go outside, you fill it with dirt and you shake the jar really quick and then set it down. Within about 30 seconds, you'll see numerous different layers form based on that, how the water sorts different material in the earth, and you'll see those layers form very, very quickly. And so you can do that as a little experiment for yourself. But that's one of the predictions we can make. The second one is that we should find billions of fossils, as well as coal and oil that are found within these layers and that make up some of these layers. And of course, we find just that. The third one is that there should be huge canyons and deltas showing evidence of rapid erosion. I'm going to go through some of that. And number four, there should also be, if this really did happen, there should be legends of a worldwide flood found in cultures all across the world. And what do we find? We find that to be exactly the case. There are at least over 277 documented versions or different takes on a worldwide flood found in all different cultures on all the continents. And so this is something we absolutely do see, the 277 variations of a worldwide flood. And then number five, we should find petrified trees in the vertical position extending through and connecting many layers of this strata. And I'm going to go through an example of where we do see these things and what that actually points to when it comes to our theory of how they came to be. So I mentioned before that I really wanted to go through Mount St. Helens with you in greater detail, because Mount St. Helens has given us a lot of information through observable science that again just kind of gives us a different narrative than the one we've always been told, and we have learned a lot from Mount St. Helens. And so this eruption happened on May 18th, 1980, and it is certain to be remembered as one of the most significant geologic events in the United States and of the 20th century. So the explosion on May 18th was initiated by an earthquake and rock slides involving 1/2, which is a cubic mile, of rock. As the summit and north slope slid off the volcano that morning, pressure was released inside the volcano, where super hot liquid water immediately flashed into steam. So the northward directed steam explosion released energy equivalent to 20 million tons of TNT, which toppled 150 square miles of forest in 6 minutes. This was an insane explosion. So in Spirit Lake, as you can see in this picture, north of the volcano, an enormous water wave initiated by 1/8 cubic mile of rock slide debris stripped trees from slopes as high as 850 feet above the pre-eruption water level. So the total energy output on May 18th was equivalent to 400 million tons of TNT total. That's approximately 20,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. So this explosion just wreaked massive destruction. So based on this eruption that took place May 18th, there was also a number of smaller eruptions that happened not long afterward. And the observations that have been made around what this did to the geographical area has been really interesting in proposing another narrative again than the one that we've always been told. So the processes that we've observed have challenged the traditional uniformitarian way of thinking about how the Earth works, and it actually has served like a miniature laboratory for catastrophism. And so a number of scientists spent 3 summers investigating the geologic changes which have occurred at the volcano. And 4 of the most significant discoveries are summarized in a short report that I'm just going to show you a few things from. So I'll take a couple things out of the report. But the 4 main areas where we have observed something that's been revealing a different narrative than what we've always been told is, number 1, rapid formed stratification, rapid erosion, upright deposited logs, and peat layer in the Spirit Lake. And so I'm going to just break down each one of these real quick and just show you what I'm talking about. So this picture right here is actually known as the Mini Grand Canyon. And now you'll notice that there's a small stream at the bottom. And, according to uniformitarianism, which is the main foundation for the Earth being so old, we would say that this canyon was slowly created over millions and millions of years, and that little stream slowly carved out this canyon. So the question is, when we look at this canyon, according to uniformitarianism, we should believe it took millions of years, but how long do you think this actually took? That's the question. How long do you think this really took? It actually happened in hours and days. Mount St. Helens formed this in a matter of hours and days. And again, this was due to a catastrophic event. And so it's just changing a little bit the narrative that we've always heard, because had we not known Mount St. Helens erupted and we just were to walk into this canyon, we would believe that that took millions of years to form. Some of the canyon is as deep as 160 feet. 160 feet. Happened in a matter of days. And so, just again, with what we've actually observed, does it really take millions of years for this to happen, or can a catastrophic event do this? And again, I point back to the flood of Noah, because the flood of Noah is the only catastrophic event that we know of that would have affected the entire planet and would have done what we see here in this picture, where you can see all these different layers of strata and this canyon's formed out. This specific piece here happened in 6 days. We literally watched this form. And again, if we've had a worldwide flood do this all across the world, then we should find things like this that, again, because of what we've been told, they have an appearance of age. But what we've actually observed is they do have the capability of forming incredibly rapidly. And so, moving on just from the rapid strata formation we've witnessed, let's look at the erosion. And so, mud flows were responsible for the most significant erosion that took place after the eruption. So, a mud flow on March 19th, 1982, eroded a canyon system, a specific one, up to 140 feet deep in the headwaters of the North Fork of the Toutle River Valley. This established a new pattern of drainage. And so as scientists surveyed this new terrain, they began to contemplate the processes which may have formed the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. And so they're looking at this and they're like, man, you know what, based on what we've seen here, maybe this actually gives a clue to how the Grand Canyon was also formed rapidly due to a flood. And so the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle River is 1/40th scale model of the real Grand Canyon. The small creeks which flow from the headwaters of the Toutle River today might seem, again by present appearances, to have carved these canyons very slowly over a long period of time, except for the fact that the erosion was observed to have occurred rapidly. And so geologists should learn that, since the long time scale that they have been trained to assign to landform development would lead to an obvious error on Mount St. Helens, that perhaps it also may be useless or just misleading elsewhere in the across the planet. And so just again, based on how quickly we've seen erosion do what it's done in this valley, we could learn that from a similar case with the Grand Canyon, we see similar erosion signs, that perhaps the Grand Canyon isn't as old as we've been told it is, because we've witnessed this happening very, very quickly due to a catastrophic event being Mount St. Helens. And so moving on to the third observation that we made, they found a layer of peat at the bottom of Spirit Lake. So peat, which is also known as turf, is an accumulation of partially decayed vegetation or organic matter. And so peat is actually the very first step in the formation of coal. And so you can see in this picture that there's an enormous log mat that's floating on Spirit Lake. And all the trees that are floating here have lost their bark and branches by the abrasive action of wind and waves. And so there's some scientists who did some scuba diving, and they wanted to see what was going on underneath at the bottom of the lake. And so they went down, and they noticed that the bottom was saturated with sheets of tree bark that were forming a layer of peat several inches thick at the bottom. And so Spirit Lake peat resembles, both compositionally and texturally, certain coal beds of the eastern United States, which are also dominated by tree bark and appear to have accumulated beneath floating log mats. So now coal is supposed to, conventionally, believed to have been accumulated from organic material that accumulates in swamps. Because the accumulation of peat in swamps is a slow process, geologists have supposed that coal beds required 1,000 years to form each inch of coal. So we've been told that it takes at least 1,000 years for 1 inch of coal to be made. The peat layer in Spirit Lake, however, demonstrate that peat accumulates rapidly. Swamp peats, however, have only very rare bark sheet material because the intrusive action of tree roots disintegrates and homogenizes the peat. So the Spirit Lake peat, in contrast, is texturally very similar to coal. All that is needed is burial and slight heating to transform Spirit Lake peat into coal, and thus, at Spirit Lake, we may have seen the first stage in the formation of coal, again happening very, very quickly. And so the last and the fourth observation that we've made through the eruption at Mount St. Helens is that a landslide generated waves on Spirit Lake that stripped the forest from the slopes adjacent to the lake and created an enormous log mat, like the picture I showed you in the previous slide. And it's made up of millions of prone floating trunks that occupy about 2 square miles of the lake's surface. And so these logs float freely as the wind blows them, and the decreasing size of the log mat indicates that the trees are gradually sinking to the lake floor. So this big log mat is getting smaller and smaller because all these trees are sinking and ending up on the floor of the lake. And so careful observation of the floating log mat indicates that many trees float in the upright position, with a root ball submerging the root end of the trunk, while the opposite end floats out in the water. And I'm sure you guys have seen this before, and as you can see in this picture, there's these vertical trees that are actually straight up and down because the root ball gets saturated with water, and it's obviously heavier than the top because it has more mass. And so these trees float vertically up and down. And so you again can see this in the picture, but they're seeing it on a mass scale on Spirit Lake. And so hundreds of upright floated and deposited logs have been grounded in shallow water along the shore of the lake. Now, these trees buried in sediment would appear, if we would just look at geology in how we've been told to interpret it, it would appear that this forest formed over hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet that's not a forest forming at all. It's actually a forest that was destroyed. But because these logs are in the upright position, being buried in different layers of sediment, it gives it, again, the appearance of age based on how we've interpreted things. For example, the upright petrified forests at Yellowstone National Park are an example of looking at something we see here and saying, man, that must have taken hundreds and hundreds of years for that forest to form, and therefore we know the rough age of it. But we saw this happen on a catastrophic event through Mount St. Helens, and it wasn't a forest being planted at all. It was actually a forest being destroyed and submerged in water. And that's kind of interesting because we should then, if there was a flood, we should see this happening across the world. We should find these different logs floating upright, buried and connected by various layers of strata. And so in August of 1985, when they were doing these scuba diving investigations, they estimated that there was roughly 19,000 upright stumps that exist on the floor of the lake. The average height of an upright deposited stump is about 20 feet. So sonar records and scuba investigations verified that many of the upright deposited trees have root masses radiating away from the bottom of the trunks. Furthermore, the trees are randomly spaced. They're not clumped together. So over the bottom of the lake, again, they are having an appearance of being like a forest. Scuba investigation of the upright deposit trunks show that some are already solidly buried by sedimentation with more than 3 feet of sediment around their bases, while others have no sediment around their bases at all. This proved that the upright trees were deposited at different times, with their roots buried at different levels. If found buried in the stratigraphic record, these trees might have been interpreted as multiple forests which grew on different levels over periods of thousands of years. The Spirit Lake upright deposited stumps, therefore, have considerable implications for interpreting petrified forests in the stratigraphic record. And so, again, we're just watching that it's giving this appearance of something happening over, hundreds or thousands of years, based on what we've seen in other places of the world, that actually happened very quickly due to a catastrophic event that involved a lot of water. So I just gave you, just a real quick rundown of some of the interesting discoveries made around Mount St. Helens. But in conclusion, we really find that it provides a rare opportunity to study transient geologic processes which produced within a few months changes that geologists might otherwise assumed would have required many thousands of years to take place. And so the volcano, therefore, challenges our way of thinking about how the earth works, how it changes, and the time scale we're accustomed to attaching to its formations. These processes and their effects allow Mount St. Helens to serve as a miniature laboratory for catastrophism. So again, Mount St. Helens actually helps us imagine a little bit what it might have looked like in the biblical flood of Noah that covered the whole earth, and some of the things we see took place because of this catastrophic event and leaving its evidence behind. And so in Mount St. Helens, we see the interaction of a catastrophic event and erosion and strata layers forming very quickly, and also how that affects water and then the trees that went into the lake, and how that's given also an appearance of a forest growing over years, but actually it was a forest being destroyed and just deposited into the sediments at the lake bottom as they piled up over short periods of time. And so the Mount St. Helens eruption is a really fascinating look at what observational science has taught us about a different narrative when it comes to how we're interpreting geographic things and in geological ways. And so, it's just really interesting. So based on that observation, we look at the Grand Canyon, and this is something I just want to kind of call out, because the creation's interpretation of the Grand Canyon is that it formed quickly by lots of water and a little time. Evolutionist interpretation is that it formed slowly by little water and lots of time. In the middle, we have the fact that the Grand Canyon exists. But what evolutionists are always trying to do is erase that line that make their students think that their interpretation is part of the fact, where it's not. It's not part of the fact. It's just their interpretation of what they're seeing. So again, the Grand Canyon is an interesting one to look at, because you can so clearly see the very different interpretation methods that are used to back up each one's theory. And I just didn't want to spend a ton of time on the Grand Canyon, but if you were to look into the Grand Canyon for yourself, it is fascinating, some of the discoveries that they have made. And if you look at the creationist interpretation, it being formed very quickly by lots of water and little time is far more plausible than it being formed slowly with little water over lots of time. And so I just wanted to point this one out. And of course, you could call me biased because it's what I believe, and evolutionists would have to call their interpretation biased because it's what they believe. The thing is, nobody was there to see it formed, and so we just have our own interpretations of the evidence that's left behind. But the only fact in the middle of all of it is that the Grand Canyon exists. That's the only thing we really have as an absolute fact. And so I just wanted to point that out, because they're proposing their theory as if it's fact, and it can't be, in the sense of being proved that way, because we've seen some other things like Mount St. Helens give us a very different narrative that would make that interpretation crumble. And so is it possible to say with absolute certainty that the Grand Canyon was formed by the flood? I don't think it'd be fair to say that scientifically, because I wasn't there to observe it. And I also don't think it'd be fair to say that it formed over millions and millions of years, because I also wasn't there to observe that. And so again, we're just taking evidence and approaching it from two very different narratives. So moving on, I want to just look at a couple other discoveries that have been made that lend credence to the fact that these trees that we see standing vertical must have been buried very, very quickly, again due to a flood, because we see what effects a flood has on trees. It causes them, and a lot of times, to stand upright when their roots get waterlogged and they stand in the vertical position, and then they're buried rapidly by lots of different silt and soot and mud and dirt, and they get buried and they stand vertically in those layers. And so this was an interesting find. It happened as it says here, in Block 47 of the Mississippi River Canyon Field, where they were drilling for a Chevron oil company. And they went through 1,000 feet of permafrost. You can kind of see it in the picture here. They went through 1,000 feet of permafrost, and then they kept drilling, and they went 14,000 feet down. And they ended up drilling through a 300-foot tall tree that was standing straight up. And not only was it standing straight up, but it was connecting many different layers of strata. Now, according to, again, secular scientists, that strata should take millions and millions of years to pile up, especially 300 feet. That's a lot of strata. And yet it's all connecting this single tree because it was buried very quickly. And again, what gave the appearance of age is proven to show in this find that no, this tree actually got buried very quickly, and it's connecting all these layers of strata, which should have thousands and if not eventually millions of years in between them. They don't. They were all rapidly formed and rapidly buried at the same time. So in Germany, France, and the British Isles, Nova Scotia, California, and several eastern states, they found fossils that extend through several layers of sedimentary rock. And in these layers, they have found these trees that are petrified, connecting all these different layers. And so it says in the red box there, one type of polystrat fossil, which is a tree, in California is especially interesting. Near Santa Barbara, fish fossils extend through several layers of algae fossils. Evolutionists calculate that each algae layer took hundreds or thousands of years to form, but that would mean that the head and tail of the same fish were buried several thousand years apart. And so you can see with this tree here that's connecting, again, just a bunch of different layers. You can see the little white line there that says 1 meter. They found these different fish in there as well, and they're have different layers going through a single fish. And so you got a vertical fish that's kind of buried straight up like this, and there's a layer that goes through his head and a layer that goes through his tail. And if we believe what we've always been told, that these layers are thousands of years old, then that means that fish was buried thousands of years apart, and yet it was buried at the exact same time. I mean, that's why it could fossilize anyway. If you had a fish where only its tail were buried rapidly, then you would only get the tail fossil. The only way you can have the full fossil is if the full fish is buried very rapidly before it decays from elements and from other animals eating it. And so again, we just see through geological discoveries that the layers of sediment that we've been told take millions of years to form do not take very long at all. In fact, they must not take that long because of the evidence we find within them. And here's just a picture of a bunch of these trees that they have found. But the one on the top right there, kind of in the middle, I want to zoom in on that one for a sec because there's something really interesting about this guy. It's a 30-foot petrified tree. It's actually one of hundreds that were found near in the Kettle coal mines near Cockville, Tennessee. And so you'll notice that the top and the bottom are actually in different coal seams. And they're radiometric dated thousands of years different in age. And that's really interesting because it's the exact same tree. And yet the top is in coal, the middle is petrified, and the bottom's in a coal seam. And this proves that it would have been formed at the exact same time. Yet again, according to what we've been told, there should be thousands of years in between these layers. Actually, there should almost be millions between that bottom coal seam, the top coal seam. But their radiometric dating, of course, gave thousands of year different ages. As we've seen in my last video, radiometric dating is not at all an accurate method to date anything. But here's just another find that goes to back that up. And lastly, when it comes to these trees, here's more vertical trees that were found in France connecting multiple layers of strata. And so we do see this all over the earth, guys. And the only thing that explains this is a flood. It's the only thing. And if the flood really did happen, we should be finding these things all over the world, and we do. And so I want to now just, not really switching gears, but just look at it, what we've been talking about from another angle. And that is some discoveries that we have made that make what we've been told as far as the age of certain things go it kind of makes it look foolish. So, for example, coal seams, we're told that all the coal that we see should be at least 300 million years old. That's what we're told. 300 million years old is the coal that we see. And yet they found these doorknobs that were embedded in a coal formation. So, according to evolutionists, we didn't even evolve 250,000 to 300,000 years ago. So what are doorknobs doing in 300 million year old coal? Doesn't make any sense. That's not the only thing that we found in coal, though. This copper bell was found encased in a coal bed in 1944 in West Virginia by a 10-year-old boy. And this, too, was dated to be 300 million years old. And so again, we have a problem here, guys. Here's this amazing bell, and they've done a number of different investigations on this bell and have really studied it. And it's a legit bell that was literally buried in coal. And again, that should be absolutely impossible if coal formations really are 300 million years old. In June of 1936, a couple out for a walk discovered a wood handle sticking out of a rock. When they took it home and cracked the rock open, they found a handle attached to an iron hammerhead. A group of archaeologists dated the rock to be 400 million years old and the hammer itself to be 500 million years old. Additionally, the iron head is made of more than 96% iron, which is far more pure than anything nature could have achieved without the assistance from modern technology. And so again, this isn't just some freak form of nature. This was actually made by people. And yet it was dated, the rock was dated to be 400 million years old, and the hammer itself was dated to be 500 million years old. And so again, guys, we're just seeing this continuation of an appearance of age according to the secular scientific narration that we've all been fed our whole lives. And we're seeing evidence that goes completely against that and proves it to be false, gained again by actual observation, which is far more scientific than just assumption and theory. We are seeing these things with our own eyes, and they're telling us that things are not as old as they appear. And so switching gears here just a little bit again, I want to look at the Sahara Desert because it's another head scratcher when it comes to the age of the earth. And if you do a quick Google search of how old is the Sahara Desert, you'll get an answer of 4.6 million years based on potassium argon dating. So some scientists went in and they've got some lava flows around the desert, and they potassium argon dated them to be 4.6 million years old. And I've already covered extensively how inaccurate and unreliable potassium argon dating is. And so there's actually another method that you can use to date this desert that is, in my opinion, far more reliable and accurate. And that is that there's a prevailing wind pattern that takes place in the Sahara Desert, which means that the wind is always blowing in the same direction, or almost always blowing in the same direction. And this creates a problem because the hot air comes off the desert and kills the tree next door, and then that area becomes a desert. And so this desert is continually growing as these prevailing winds keep expanding the desert and killing what's next door to it. And so, as I'm sure you've heard in grade school, this process is called desertification. So it's based on the rate that this process has been observed to take place. The Sahara Desert has been studied very carefully, and German scientists have concluded that it is about 4,000 years old, as that is when it's believed to have began growing. And so places in North Africa like Egypt actually used to be fertile land all over the place. So what's interesting about this is that if the earth is really millions of years old, and yet the biggest desert in the world is only 4,000 years old, how come we don't have a much bigger and a much older desert somewhere else? The Sahara Desert, it's the biggest desert in the whole world. and it's only 4,000 years old, based on actual observable science that these German scientists did, where they did a much more accurate dating method for this desert. It's not that old. And if the flood happened over 4,400 years ago, then we shouldn't actually see a desert older than that. And we don't. And so again, if it was millions of years old, we should have a massive, massive desert somewhere. And when we don't have one bigger than this. And so it's an interesting observation. So what I find even more interesting is that in 2011 in Niger, which is at the heart of the Sahara Desert, an American paleontologist named Paul Sereno found human skeletons that they dated to be under 10,000 years old, and there were nearly 200 burial plots found when they were actually trying to find dinosaur bones. They found this this location where all these human skeletons were that were under 10,000 years old, and you might be like, well, that's not surprising. Why is that a big deal? And it's not so much the humans that they found as it is what they found with them. One girl was found to be wearing a bracelet made from hippo bones, and another was buried inside of a turtle shell. Other bones were scattered close by, including more turtle shells and fish skeletons. This is in the heart of the Sahara Desert. There is no water near this place. So this also goes to show the age of the Sahara Desert is thousands of years old and not millions, as marine animals are found with human skeletons that cannot be older than 10,000 years. And so again, if you do your little Google search, the Sahara Desert's 4.6 million years old. And yet that's impossible if we're finding marine animals buried with human skeletons. And the human skeletons are under 10,000 years old. It's impossible for the Sahara Desert to be as old as they tell you it is in secular science. And so that again lends credence to what the German scientists discovered of it only being 4,000 years old. And so this marine life being found in the middle of the desert is something you would expect if there really was a worldwide flood. In 1902, in Egypt, 93 miles southwest of Cairo, Egypt, a whale graveyard was discovered. Among the giant whale bones were also many other marine animal fossils. They are actually an extinct species of whale and are believed to be the oldest ever found. Are these bones cool? Look at that thing. Can you imagine finding that in the middle of the desert? It's pretty neat. The largest one discovered was 66 feet in length, and this again goes to show that the Sahara Desert was indeed covered by water. Man, I can't imagine seeing that thing in the ocean. 66 feet long. It's the biggest whale species ever found. And where is it? In the middle of the desert. Again, you'd expect to find that if there really was a worldwide flood, and we do. So after looking at some sand, let's look at some ice. There's another interesting example of how some scientists have made a big mistake when calculating the Earth's age. And there was a group of scientists that actually wanted to go and show how the Earth was way older than 6,000 years, and they wanted to prove it through the ice. And so they were doing a number of scientific studies in Greenland, and they, again, wanted to find evidence for how old the Earth really is. And so when they did this, they set out to show how old it was, like I said, but they actually ended up having it backfire on them, and it gives us a younger age. And so I'll explain how this works. When drilling these holes, you can see how layers of ice build up into rings. And so some are dark and some are light. And this is kind of similar to what we would see in tree rings. They say each ring in the tree is a year old, and they would say these rings in the ice are also a year old. 2 of them are a year old. And they say that because the ring represents summer, where the top layer of ice or of snow melts and refreezes as clear ice, which shows up as a dark ring. And then in winter, the snow packs and shows up as a white layer. And thus you have 2 rings, which equals 1 year. So you can see the darker layer there is summer, where it's thawing and then freezing. And then the whiter layer is winter, where the snow packs and it just freezes. And so you have, they're assuming then that each of these rings is 1 year. And so the furthest that they drilled down was 10,000 feet. And after counting all the rings, according to their theory, the Earth was at least 135,000 years old. And I'd just like to pause it there for a second, because we obviously know that you're not going to find the age of the Earth, as these scientists would have also known. You're not going to find the age of the Earth simply by drilling through ice, because the ice was not always there. And so it's not an accurate method of dating the actual age of the whole Earth. You maybe can date the age of the ice, but it's not going to give you the age of the Earth. But what they were just simply trying to do was show that if the ice itself is at least 135,000 years old, then there's no way the Earth is thousands of years old like creationists propose. And so it's just important to make that comment so that you know where they're coming from. But the problem is that they, again, have this assuming that the ice rings are annual, that the rings are annual rings. And these kinds of assumptions are many assumptions that are made quite liberally, that are based on their theory and interpretation to what they see, versus the actual science of what's being observed. And so, they'll see these rings and they'll assume, okay, that's a year, so it's obviously, thousands of years old. Whereas, they do the same thing with the strata. They see a few layers of strata, well, that must be thousands or millions of years old. And so again, they're applying their worldview to the evidence that they see. And it leads to mistakes like this, in that believing that the ice rings are just that, annual. And you'll see in a minute how it's a mistake. So they had never heard about the Lost Squadron when these scientists did this. It was a World War II plane that ran out of gas and crash landed in Greenland. So the airplane got left there in 1942 and was forgotten. However, in the 1990s, a millionaire from Kentucky, U.S., got the great idea of going and finding it because he wanted to bring it home. So he went looking for it and used ground-penetrating radar to locate the plane. And so this is in the 90s. This went down in 1942, and then in the early 90s, this millionaire goes and he finds this plane. The Lost Squadron was covered by 263 feet of ice in just 48 years. And so these guys melted a hole to get down to the plane, which was 263 feet down. And they got down to it, they took it all apart, and they brought it back up through the hole, and they put it back together in Middlesboro, Kentucky. And you can actually go there and still see it to this day. So just as a visual comparison here, it would be like seeing this 26-story building get completely buried by ice in just under 50 years, guys. Just under 50 years. We've observed this actually take place. So in 48 years, the plane was buried in 263 feet of ice, which is about 5.5 feet per year. The deepest hole ever drilled is 10,000 feet. Of ice. 10,000 divided by 5.5 is only 1,824 years, not anywhere near the 135,000 years that these scientists told us it was. So now deeper layers do get squished by the weight, but giving even 4,400 years to accumulate for the ice we see at the poles is absolutely no problem. Yet if the Earth is millions of years old, then why isn't there more ice in the North and South poles? So the man who dug out the plane is Bob Cardin, and he said that at 62 feet down they hit a plywood cover left behind from a 1983 expedition which took place 8 years earlier. So some other guys also tried to go get this plane out, and they didn't pull it off. And so that means that 8 feet of snow accumulated each year prior. So now we've gone even above the 5.5 feet. Now we're at over 8 feet per year since the 1983 expedition. So what's more is Bob also saw the dark and white rings that scientists had claimed to be annual rings. When asked how many he saw, he said several hundred of them. However, if they were annual rings, then there should be only 48, since the plane had landed there only 48 years ago. So this meant that the rings were not based on winter and summer, but rather melting and freezing, which can happen many times in just 1 year. They ended up observing 40 rings in a 9-year period. 40 rings in a 9-year period. However, in Scientific America, in the Scientific Magazine, an article on page 82 in 1998 called these rings annual rings. And here again, we see bad science making serious mistakes, which leads to great miscalculation, and yet the public believes it simply because it's written in a science magazine. They never came out and rectified this problem in calling out the mistake they made. It's just left in this scientific magazine, and we're supposed to believe that those are annual rings now because scientists said so, when we have observed that it's not annual, it's based on melting and freezing. And so again, an appearance of age when there actually isn't one. So we've gone from ice and sand. We're going to look at some water now, and I'm going to close this video here pretty quick. But when it rains, 30% of the water runs into the ocean, bringing with it mineral salts every time it rains. So the oceans are getting saltier every day and are currently around 3.6% salt. So if you use the theory of uniformitarianism and just go back, that what we see today is how we see this happening today is the way it's always been happening, then at this rate they could have gone from entirely fresh water to salt in less than 5,000 years. So if the Earth is millions of years old, the oceans should be like the Dead Sea. They should be so salty that there shouldn't be life in them. They should be incredibly salty if they're millions and millions of years old. And again, if you rewind the clock, just 5,000 years ago, they would have been freshwater. And so there's no way that the oceans are millions of years old based on what we've observed, its accumulation of salt each year. And so, you might say, well, if it was freshwater only 5,000 years ago and yet it's saltwater now, then how did these animals, survive if it turned all to salt? And that's again where we see the first type of evolution, which is true, the microevolution, where animals adapt and there are adaptations within different kinds. An example of this is these fighting fish. You can do an experiment that reveals adaptation, not evolution, like macroevolution. And so if you take these fish, you can slowly add salt to the fish tank, and this fish will adapt to the salt and live no problem. So if you slowly add salt to this freshwater fish's tank and eventually turn the whole tank into salt water, that fish will adapt to that salt water just fine. What's interesting though is if after it's adapted to the salt water, if you take it out and put it back into fresh water, the fish dies because it's adapted to the salt water. And you can do this to a poor fish at home if you want, but they will adapt to salt water, and then when you throw them back into fresh water, they die. And so it's not a problem given thousands of years. If this happens for a fish in a short period of time, think about thousands of years. These animals could totally adapt from fresh water to salt water with no problem given that period of time. But millions of years, they should all be dead because the sea would be so salty. And so now we're going to go look at the largest coral reef in the world, which is found in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. And it is widely accepted that the Barrier Reef is 500,000 years old, and the modern reef that we see today is between 6,000 to 8,000 years old. And so this larger age is again gained through radiometric dating. But something kind of cool happened it wasn't cool in what happened, but what they did with it was kind of neat, and that is that in the Second World War, much of the Barrier Reef was destroyed by bombs, anchors, and sunken ships. After the war, scientists went to study the reef and see how fast it could grow. They carefully observed and studied it for 20 years, and after 20 years, they concluded that the reef was just under 4,200 years old. Again, based on observational science, not this crazy, unreliable radiometric dating method, but actual science, based on the growth that they watched in the 20 years, rewinding it back, they saw like, man, this reef can't be actually older than 4,200 years, which again lines up neatly being under the age that the flood happened 4,400 years ago. Again, we just see these ages continue to line up with the biblical narrative. So again, if the Earth is millions of years old, why don't we see a bigger and older reef somewhere else? Why would the biggest and oldest reef be under 4,200 years old? And so again, guys, we're just seeing this across the planet. It's not just in one or two places. It's all over the place. where we have been told that things are so old just based on their appearance because of how we've believed things have been formed in the past. And as we've seen through a number of actual observations, things that we've been told take thousands or millions of years to happen have happened within hours, days, and months through observable scientific observation. And so, yeah, I just wanted to show you guys some more discoveries. I got, I don't know, probably just a couple more videos to go, and then I'm going to wrap up the evolution versus creation. But I hope you found this one interesting, and we'll see you in the next video.